Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of the Fiscal Forum on investing in infrastructure, making public investment more efficient. I'm Shamini Kore. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm the director of the Institute for Capacity Development at the Fund. I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent group of panelists with a broad set of professional backgrounds. So let me just first introduce them. On my immediate left is Masatsugo Asakawa, Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs of Japan. With his distinguished public service career and a very close involvement in the G20 agenda, he will be able to provide both global and country perspectives on today's topic. Next to him is Bambang Brojonegoro. He's Indonesia's Minister of National Development Planning, which puts him at the heart of Indonesia's ramping up of infrastructure investment and institutional reforms to improve public investment management practices. And next to him is Bedri Hamza. He's the Minister of Finance of Kosovo, a country that is investing heavily in infrastructure and which has undergone an extensive assessment of its infrastructure governance system. And next to him is Pierre Lavallee. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which puts him at the front line of infrastructure investments with private capital participation. And at the very end is Stefano Manservisi, is Director General of the European Commission's International Cooperation and Development Directorate General, otherwise known as DEVCO, which supports capacity development, including in the area of infrastructure governance in many emerging markets and developing countries. So investment in infrastructure, we all know, is critical to boost productivity and ensure inclusive growth. However, historically low government investment and infrastructure bottlenecks in many countries, as well as the imperative to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, all point to a really large infrastructure needs really around many, many emerging markets and developing countries. We will start the discussion with exploring these needs and the economic and social benefits from meeting them. Apart from mobilizing resources and identifying needs, efficiency in selecting, designing, and executing infrastructure projects is also critically important. This is going to be the second second part of our discussion. And we're going to hear from the experience of our panelists with raising the quality of infrastructure investments. This will be followed by a more granular discussion of the institutions that are needed to ensure effective infrastructure governance processes. So that's a brief overview of how we'll design this session. Let me also just do a little bit of housekeeping. We will have 3 rounds of questioning. The panelists will answer 2 to 3 minutes. Maybe I hope we'll have some back and forth a little bit if we can do that. I will open the floor at the end for questions from you. Also, there will be interpretation from Albanian when Minister Hamza speaks. That will be on channel 1 on your headsets. And finally, we will have a cocktail reception at the end of this session in the atrium outside. So let me start. So with the part 1, the first session, we'd like to talk about infrastructure needs and the expected benefits from addressing them. Mr. Asakawa, Japan has been promoting quality infrastructure investment as a priority on the ongoing G20 presidency. Could you tell us what infrastructure needs and deficiencies the G20 Global Infrastructure Initiative addresses? What would be the economic, social benefits of meeting these needs, if you can give us a global sense?
Yeah, thank you, Sharmini. Well, as you rightly mentioned, we put the highest priority on this agenda, high-quality infrastructure, in terms of our G20 presidency. And let me explain why we decided to do so. It's true that in infrastructure financing, there has been a huge gap between demand and supply everywhere in the world. And for example, in Asian region, according to ADB estimate, we have the gap of $1.7 trillion every year from now to year 2030. So, there is a natural tendency for us to discuss how to fill the gap by increasing the supply in the infrastructure financing sources, and how to, increase our ODA, how to establish another, international organizations like AIIB and so on. They are all good. But it's also clear that, simply, trying to increase the, public financing, public resources for infrastructure is far from enough to satisfy fill up this gap. So the key is how to attract private sector financing, how to crowd in private sector financing. And in order to do so, we have a strong opinion that we need to highlight the quality side of the infrastructure. Actually, for instance, infrastructure projects associated with stable income streams and low maintenance costs can provide good investment opportunities for long-term institutional investors like pension fund, in spite of relatively high initial costs. Moreover, if the quality of infrastructure improves, users would be willing to pay cost recovery user charges, thus helping attract private sector investment in infrastructure. So therefore, I do believe that promoting quality infrastructure investment concept is highly likely to contribute to crowding in private investment. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Mansavisi, as Director General of DevCo, you're responsible for supporting development policies throughout the world. In his opening remarks today, Mr. Lipton referenced the IMF's work on large infrastructure needs to deliver the SDG agenda. From your viewpoint, can you tell us how the international community is supporting countries to meet these infrastructure needs?
Well, thank you very much. I think that when we speak about infrastructure now in these days, we start with the huge needs and therefore talking about trillions immediately, which is obviously true. But in our role also of public, let's say, institution, which is carrying dialogue with the partners and which is sharing also experience, I think that immediately after having identified the huge needs and the big amounts, we usually say, okay, let's prioritize. It seems quite obvious, but it is not quite obvious, because we have to prioritize in order to, as you said, investing in people, in the sense that we have to prioritize this infrastructure which are immediately bringing benefit to people. Because otherwise, there is a bulk of things to do. The first thing is prioritizing and taking SDGs plan. Point number one. Point number two is to plan financing. And this is another issue which seems quite obvious, but it is not, because it must be done on the basis of the financial plan which are existing or not at the level of a country in order to have a sort of portfolio which can then be mobilized. So there are foreign investments, there are foreign intervention and foreign aids, and there are national resources. So it is important, therefore, and this is what we are doing these days, to promote a national integrated financial framework in which the decision about priorities are then embedded into a sustainable plan of financing. These are two things that I would like to underline. Third point, increasingly, but maybe we'll come back later, the test is to have infrastructure which are connecting people and market also beyond what are the borders. So to have a regional and or, let's say, market-oriented in terms of competitiveness that these infrastructure are generating. So these are, let's say, criteria that we use in sitting and dialoguing with our partners in order to, let's say, also share our experience, because otherwise there is a risk to create a big wave, but then at the end, maybe we'll talk also later, the sustainability, financially speaking, and the result, output-oriented, could be also doubtful.
Very good, thank you. So let's look at the country experiences. So we have Kosovo, Indonesia, and Canada covered. Minister Hansa, the annual budget in capital budget in Kosovo is relatively high by international standards. What are Kosovo's infrastructure investment priorities, which Mr. Mansavisi just talked about, and what economic effects do you expect from meeting them?
Kosova për shkak kalumes historike.
Kosovo, because of its historical past, has inherited a small stock of public capital, very poor infrastructure, and in order to improve this situation, a large part of the budget has gone into capital projects and increasing the stock of public capital. Therefore, Kosovo at the moment is one of the few countries where the annual capital budget has accounted for 9% of the GDP of the total spending, and the aim is to improve the situation. 35% of total public spending goes to capital investment. Infrastructure has been the main priority, so roads, railroads, schools, clinics, and health infrastructure. And what we've seen is improvement in the short and long term. We have had improvement in demand, and as well that has brought about economic growth, which in Kosovo we have seen the largest economic growth in the region, up to 4%. In the long term, it has brought about increased productivity and improvement of conditions for future improvement in the private sector. Countries like Kosovo need to prioritize and need to pay attention, because these large projects could eat up a large part of the public spending. That's why priority is very important in choosing and studying the feasibility of the projects, and above all, the cost of financing and sustainability of this project.
Thank you. Very good. Minister Bojonegoro, government and SOE infrastructure spending in Indonesia has increased significantly in recent years. Could you explain the objectives of this infrastructure push? You know, you're making a major effort, I understand, to attract private capital and FDI into infrastructure investment. How do you see the risks and reward of private capital involvement?
Yeah. There are two main reasons why we had the push for the infrastructure development since this current government started in 2014. The first would be our infrastructure stock. Our infrastructure stock to the GDP in Indonesia when we came into power in 2014 was only 35%. It was way below the average of the both emerging and developed economy, around 70%. So with all the effort, 2017, we already increased the stock up to 43%, but still, it's way below the standard for the emerging and developed economy at 70%. So we have still 27% to catch. That's the first reason. The second reason, whenever we are talking about the factors that affecting FDI coming to Indonesia, the main concern for many investors on top three is either red tape bureaucracy, the corruption, and the other one is infrastructure. So infrastructure is always a factor that could prohibit the FDI coming to Indonesia. So we need to improve the attractiveness of Indonesia for any FDI. We need FDI for sure. So with these two reasons, we lay out the plan in 2015 up to 2019, 360 billion investment of infrastructure. Of course, with the tax ratio at that time around 11%, government budget will not be enough. That's why the state-owned enterprise, as you rightly mentioned, also came into picture. Our estimation at that time, government budget could contribute only up to 42-43%. The state-owned enterprise could contribute 20%, and the rest has to come from the private sector. So basically, that's the reason why state-owned enterprise role is quite important in Indonesia. Of course, we are now trying to attract private sector, but at the beginning of the government, to attract private sector, just go directly into infrastructure project will be quite risky, at least from the private sector point of view. So state-owned enterprise came first, but after that, there is more confidence from private sector to join infrastructure development in Indonesia. And now we have both public-private partnership scheme as well as full private sector participation in some of the infrastructure or big infrastructure projects in Indonesia.
Yeah, if I can just follow up. So, Mr. Mansavisi and Minister Hamza both talked about prioritization. I mean, Indonesia is a vast country, very complex. I would imagine to figure out your infrastructure needs. And how did you go about? I mean, before you do the financing, I guess you got multiple sources of financing in the private sector. How do you go about prioritizing? Which to do first, and what are the key urgent needs versus what you might have financing for? How do you manage that? Could you shed some light on that?
Certainly, it's actually main job of our institution at Ministry of Planning. So number one, of course, Indonesia, as you rightly mentioned, is a very so-called complicated in terms of geographical condition. We are one of the largest archipelagic country in the world. So the key word is connectivity. Connectivity among islands, connectivity inland, and also connectivity between the source of raw material and processing activities. So the keyword of connectivity has to be translated into infrastructure projects. So when we do prioritization, the first one, we look at the activities, infrastructure projects that will help improving the quality of life of people. Clean water, sanitation, housing, and also basic electricity, arterial road. That has to be financed by the budget because there is no way private sector will be involved. But then we also look at the infrastructure that will help supporting economic growth, connectivity, but between economic activities. And then private sector or state-owned enterprise can jump in because we are talking about projects like big power plant, the seaport, the airport, as well as the toll roads. And of course, there are the third type of projects that have to be built in Indonesia, given the fact now Indonesia is already urbanized country, more than 50% of our population living in urban area. So we now start building more mass public transportation, including the very first MRT that just launched in Jakarta at the 1st April. So with this project, of course, at the beginning, we still need, for example, loan from Japan government. But later, of course, we cannot rely only on the loan or budget. Instead, we will go for more PPP on this public transportation project.
Right.
So I think the picture is quite clear, and that's our job to define which project goes for budget, which project for PPP, and which project goes entirely to the private sector.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Maybe that's a good point at which to turn to Mr. Lavallée. You're the head of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was created to invest alongside private capital in new revenue-generating infrastructure that the minister just talked about. Could you share Canada's experience in this area and outline the rationale that's been used in this approach?
Sure, thank you. So the rationale has been alluded to by a couple of the previous speakers in terms of the overall infrastructure gap. Canada fits the global pattern. We have a gap that, depending on the estimate, ranges between $500 billion and $1 trillion, speaking to your trillions very quickly. And in response to that, our government a couple of years ago established the largest commitment of federal funding to try to close that gap, and that's $190 billion. So the math is quite simple. Even with the largest commitment over the longest period by federal government, even if you assume that the other levels of government, the provinces, territories, municipalities, also put in their share of funding, there is still a gap to be filled. There will be a gap to be filled. It's predictable. And this is where the notion of trying to do things differently than the way they have been done in Canada, including the fact that we actually have a good history of using PPPs in Canada, but they have been used in a very specific way and have evolved in a very specific way. And so our role is to complement what's already in place, but in doing so, transforming the way infrastructure is planned, financed, and delivered in the country. And in order to do that, we've created the bank. I've been in place now for a little less than a year. And so we're building an organization, really building a center of expertise for Canada, for investing in Canada, using a different formula. And in order to do that well, we're developing also an advisory team. We've put in place an advisory team as well as a knowledge management team so that we can bring together the expertise from across the country but also from around the world so that we can create new infrastructure in Canada that will be revenue generating, that will attract private capital, but where the infrastructure is built in the public interest. And maybe I'll stop there and we can follow up.
Okay, very good. Well, let me turn to the second sort of topic, and maybe we can try to bring all the strands together at the end. So the second part we want to talk about, in fact, Mr. Asakawa, you talked about it, raising the quality of infrastructure investment. Certainly, meeting needs is not just about identifying needs and securing the financing, which we just touched on, but getting it right, achieving the targeted sort of economic and social benefits, and staying on schedule, on budget. I mean, these things are even more important. If I can turn to you again, Mr. Asakawa, could you outline Japan's initiatives to promote quality investment? I mean, how do you define quality, and also, could you share some examples from of infrastructure, sort of quality infrastructure supported by Japan? Japan's has a lot of experience in this area, and how you see the G20. You talked about it at the beginning, but I wondered if you can just elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, what does it mean, high quality infrastructure? And well, this year, in the context of G20 discussion, we are intending to produce, very clear principles, what it means. But we don't have to start from scratch, because when Japan hosted G7 3 years ago, we already raised this issue, and we after a very intensive discussion by our leaders, we could introduce the so-called Iseshima principle. Iseshima is the name of the place where we hosted the G7 summit meeting 3 years ago, and that principle included such elements as first, life cycle cost should be taken into account. So we should really look at not only at the initial construction cost, but also operational cost and also maintenance costs. So all in all, life cycle cost should be reasonably cheap. Secondly, environmental friendly. It should be really environmental friendly. As you may know it, now one of these days, many investors, including pension funds, has a greater interest in environmental impact of any infrastructure project. And thirdly, it should be disaster proof. Partly because of the maybe global warming, one of these days we are seeing more and more natural disaster happening everywhere in the world. Also in Japan, for the last 2-3 years, we experienced a lot of floods, typhoons, and everything. So we are of a strong view that infrastructure should be really disaster-proof. Oh, by the way, for this agenda, we also try to discuss in the G20 discussion so-called natural disaster financing and insurance, where we are trying to advocate the idea to establish one financing scheme utilizing insurance. And for this, where predetermined criteria be introduced. So once the damage of natural disaster exceeds that criteria or threshold, insurance money would be automatically disbursed. So country need not to wait for the insurance company to calculate the exact amount of the damage of the natural disaster. So this kind of financial scheme might support this high quality infrastructure concept in this respect. And finally, know-how or expertise should be transferred to the recipient countries. So those were already agreed 3 years ago, and it was also endorsed by G20 when China hosted its summit meeting in Hangzhou in 2016. So it was also endorsed by G20 member countries as well. But if you look at those principles now, they are nice, but something are missing. Very important elements are missing, which are governance, side of the high infrastructure concept, like debt sustainability need to be taken into account, and also openness of the infrastructure need to be secured. Transparency of the procurement need to be secured, and so on. So this year, under presidency, I would like to add those still missing but very important elements to the already existing principles, and to once again ask G20 communities to endorse that principle. And also we are aiming to produce some guidance note for practitioners. Those guidance notes are being drafted by various IOs, including IMF. And also we are aiming at producing a list of available financing tools if you are interested in getting any financing to realize, to accomplish this high-quality infrastructure project.
Thank you. Mr. Lavalley, I'll go back to you again. Part of your bank's mandate is to assess the suitability of potential projects and apply commercial best practices in project development. Could you elaborate what the Canada Infrastructure Bank is doing in this field? It's early days, but if you learned anything with respect to best practices from looking into this?
Yes, we have learned a few things, although it's still early stage. But I alluded earlier to the fact that in our structure, provinces, territories, and municipalities and indigenous governments are very important. In fact, they own 90% of the infrastructure assets in the country. And so as much as the federal financing is very important, and our $35 billion of capital that we can deploy can be a great catalyst, we have to recognize from the outset that we need to work closely with the provincial, territorial, municipal, and indigenous governments in order to ensure that we're working on their priorities and addressing the most urgent needs that they have in order to support economic growth and sustainability objectives. So lesson number one is think national but act local, I guess I would say. And in order to do that, we have actually created a team whose only focus is understanding local priorities and engaging with them, not just to understand them, but then to understand how this new toolkit that we're providing can actually fit into their construct. And by their construct, it's, of course, economic priorities, but also their own procurement processes and so on, which we need to work with since we're really a co-investor in each situation. The second lesson is that although sometimes things may look very similar from one part of the country to another, they never are quite similar. And the need for us to customize our financing solution is very important. And as we customize solution, of course, that requires a really deep understanding of the risks that are attached in each of the projects in each of the jurisdictions with which we are working. And in order to, and this is lesson number 3, is that in order for us to be effective, we therefore have to be very flexible. We can't say we did it once in one part of the country and it worked, and therefore the same approach should work in your part of the country. We may actually, and in fact do, have to adjust how we approach a project, how we structure it, and how ultimately the service is delivered. Of course, there are some commonalities that are, the investments have to fit within our mandate, which is it has to generate revenue, has to be sustainable, etc. And I guess the fourth lesson that we've learned and that served us well so far is that we have to build the team to be able to deliver on the first three lessons learned. And that's required us hiring people with a combination of experience from private sector investment in infrastructure to procurement authorities to various levels of government, so that we can interact as well as possible with the vast number of potential public sponsors that we can work with to bring to life this new model that we're proposing.
Thank you. Minister Brojonegoro, increased infrastructure spending in Indonesia went hand in hand with the improvement in the institutional framework. You just outlined that. Key measures, well, I understand, is establishing the Committee for Acceleration of Priority Infrastructure Delivery to coordinate the priority projects, as well as streamlining the land acquisition process. Could you elaborate on these initiatives and some lessons learned?
Yeah. First of all, the commission that you just mentioned is focusing on the debottlenecking. So we have so-called some national strategic projects, many types of projects, infrastructure projects. And during the implementation, there could be some hurdles, constraints like land acquisition, sometimes the approval from the local government, and many other issues. So this committee focus on how debottlenecking all these problems and make sure the project can be completed on time. That's the first thing. The second thing, the committee should also focus on how to structure the projects, especially the projects that viable for private sector participation. So any private sector, any financial institution will be interested to be participating in financing the project itself. And then more importantly, to answer your question also about the efficiency that related to this committee, we have to be aware that infrastructure is a long-term investment. So when you are talking efficiency, we are talking about long-term efficiency as well. So that's why trying to get private sector to participate in infrastructure development will be a good, will be a additional positive point for the efficiency. Why? Because if you are talking about government bureaucracy, they depend on annual budget. So the incentive to allocate enough money for maintenance will be less because they are more attracted to come up with the new projects, for example, at least rehabilitation or renovation of the existing infrastructure projects rather than maintaining for the, let's say, 10 or 20 years period. While private sectors, because they already have the concession, let's say 20 years, so they will try very hard to make sure that during the 20 years, this infrastructure project will be well maintained, so it will give them, you know, the highest profit possible. So I think the efficiency is key part, but we have to understand this is not 1 year efficiency or short-term efficiency. This is long-term efficiency.
Yeah, that seems to be a key point. We'll come back to this point on maintenance maybe in the next round. Build on that. Minister Hamza, what is your experience with getting infrastructure projects right? What obstacles did Kosovo encounter? What are the lessons you learned?
At the time when the gap between the needs and the financing is huge and noticeable, we have to make sure that we choose the right projects by considering the costs and by finding an equilibrium between the needs, the financing, but also keeping in mind also what the public debt is and what level we can afford. In Kosovo, the projects that have been financed through public funding have shown a higher level of execution, so a better use of the funds, whereas the projects that have been financed through IFIs have had a lower scale of execution, and the reason has been that human capital still needs more work. We have a great gap between local legislature, which is state legislature, and the rules and regulations that the World Bank or other institutions follow. And due to this, as much as we can, these institutions that finance such projects need to keep in mind what the local legislature is, because they create a level of inequality. We've had a case of divesting state properties, or also the effects in social and economic situations. These institutions need to keep in mind the social and economic effect that it has every time that the state divests its ownership. That's why there needs to be special attention in the way the implementation of these projects takes place. That's why we need units that coordinate and watch and oversee these projects, and the Ministry of Finance will create such a unit which will have human capacities, so specialists that will lend their expertise to other ministries and help along with identifying and implementing the projects. The main reason and the main aim is the implementation of the projects, and this will be the aim of our projects in Kosovo, but I'm sure it will be also for other institutions, or for other countries that cooperate with your institutions.
Thank you. We've talked a bit around this issue about quality. If I can come back to you, perhaps one of the two ministers, maybe Minister Hamza. Corruption is often a problem that can hinder the proper economic benefits coming from projects, from sharing the benefits. And was that an issue in Kosovo? And did you have a mechanism to, in this way, to ensure that procurement processes and other processes remain at least free of corruption?
Certain projects often require bureaucratic processes, but there are also cases of problematic procedures. But by trying to eliminate those bureaucratic processes and trying to control any chance of corruption, any leeway to corruption, we need definitely to have clear procedures on paper, transparency, and have open competition. And we're trying very hard to implement this, and that's why we're using more and more electronic bidding, procurements. So in order to keep away any human interference, but have everything through procedure, by implementing online procedures, this keeps at a minimum any corruption opportunity, any favoritism, nepotism. That is an issue because it doesn't just abuse public funding, but it interferes with competition, and it interferes with the market. Our laws are up to standard, to the European standard, up to the acquis communautaire, and that's why more and more we're trying to implement electronic procurement.
That's interesting. Let me turn to you, Mr. Manservisi. DevCo plays a major role in supporting capacity development in many countries, including to ensure that infrastructure projects are well designed and effectively implemented. Could you share some insights from this work?
Well, first, I would like to say that I fully commend and share the work that Japan has done in the framework of the Iseshima principle on quality infrastructure. I think this is extremely important because good practices should become standard in a sense. It's difficult just to work on good practices just in isolation. So we have to build a sort of consensus about this. And I think that this is generating a lot of sharing of experiences, a lot of good results. So this is point number one, because we put ourselves into this framework. And we are very committed to work even more with Japan in order to go even further. The second point, which is important in designing and then creating the condition for a good implementation, is to in our dialogue with the countries to, let's say, contribute in setting or reforming public policies. If whatever investment, being also private, of course, is outside any kind of sustainable public policies, which means also duly financed and with capacity, it is obvious that the quality of this investment and the impact of this investment could be certainly lower. In this framework, important what the IMF and also ourselves working with you on the PIMA approach is doing, because precisely this offering a way of managing and following the public investment. So therefore this is, let's say, something that I would say point number one, public policies and managing what is the public spending. Point number two is to consider that every infrastructure is put into an environment. There is the environment of the infrastructure. And this is regulatory. This is term of capacity of administration and capacity of those which are working and benefiting from that. And this is the level of government which is necessary in order to bring it forward. So the reason why in our external investment plan we articulate this in three pillars. One, the financial instrument per se, which at a certain moment on the basis of this analysis can suggest on how to go for full public, PPP or private, because this is the moment in which. Second, the pillar of what we call technical assistance, which is basically a capacity building, because we have to, with the partner, to ensure that the capacity, not only to have a good impact study, but then, according to the criteria that I just referred to, are fully respected, are fully tracked. Therefore, investing in the capacity of the state, but very often not only of the central administration, of the local administration, because infrastructure somewhere, and then they should not be managed only from the center, must be part of a management of a territory, even if they are immaterial, because they reach people in several parties. So therefore, the capacity building, and the third is the business environment, because in any case, when we are investing in infrastructure, is to generate more possibility for business doing business, and therefore the business environment and the regulatory framework are particularly important. So in order to address this, we can then modulate a different instrument, including our public budget support, because in this context, in particular, I mean, working with you, with the IMF, we can help in sharing experiences in order to allow within the public policies to have indicators which can then be used in order to assess the quality of the project and the outcome which is expected from a certain project, being public or being private, because this should be put somewhere. So this is a bit the experience that we are doing, and this is a bit, let's say, the method that we are following, obviously in a flexible way, because there is not one size fits all, but this is more or less the approach.
Great. Actually, this is also leads to exploring a bit further the institutional framework required to promote infrastructure investment. So looking into this, we're talking about, this framework applies to processes for planning, for resource allocation and implementation of public investment projects. The framework should also obviously ensure that the projects don't create excessive burden on government finances. These are some of the things that just come up. And Mr. Mansavisi just mentioned PIMA. Ministers Hamza and Brojonegoro, the IMF conducted I think we worked together with you to conduct a public investment management assessment, or PIMA, for Kosovo and Indonesia. This, for those who may not be familiar with this, it's a diagnostic of a country's infrastructure governance institutions with respect to the three elements I mentioned, the planning, the resource, the allocation, and the implementation of investment, infrastructure investment, but public investment broadly. The assessment looks at both the formal framework and that is, what does the framework look like on paper, but it also looks at its effectiveness in practice. What lessons, if I can ask you, what lessons did you learn from this assessment moving forward? What do you see as the key steps to strengthen infrastructure governance in your countries? Maybe Minister Hamza, you might want to go first, and then Mr. Prajanagora could follow.
Kosovo is the first country to request the PIMA in 2015. As far as I am informed, as far as I know, more than 50 countries by now have followed this example. I wanted to thank IMF, the Department of Technical Assistance, the countries that continue to support Kosovo financially and all these projects. My country has profited from this project. We have received very useful recommendations which have served to continue and build our legal framework. These recommendations have served to build the criteria. We have specified the criteria, and we have created the assessment system. How do we analyze the project proposals? How do we implement them? The ways to finance them and any other issues that go into a project. We are in the process of creating our legal framework in order to analyze ex post project. So it has been an amazing experience, a very important document, and I want to thank again the IMF. I want to thank their experts and their contribution, express my appreciation for their contribution to help Kosovo.
Thank you, Mr. Prajanagora.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank IMF for doing the PIMA mission to Indonesia. And if I can summarize the major finding of the mission, I think in general we have to improve the capital planning and budgeting, and at the end, of course, when it comes to the project level, we have to improve the project deliverables. So some of the detailed finding, if I can describe some of them. For example, in terms of the national and sectoral plans, we don't have basically project level information. So the detail of project level information is very much limited, and of course it will limit the effectiveness of the project. And in general, we have the difficulty to identify some major projects that will be carried out during the incoming budget year. So of course, quality control is weak, except for project that already has clear source of funding, either from loan or using the PPP or involving private sector participation. But for the projects that under the budget in general, the quality control is weak and the pipeline is not quite clear. And then in terms of project appraisal, some projects are appraised, but using non-standard methodology and with limited central support. And at the end, when we are talking about monitoring and evaluation, since we have limited focus on investment, in particular on multi-year projects, then the continuation of the projects and the potential of the projects to be completed beyond the timeline is very much, becoming expandable. So sometimes the cost overrun happens not because of the problem on the field, but more on the design and the implementation on the ministerial level.
Interesting. So, Mr. Lavalley, I'm going to draw on your you're drawing private capital into infrastructure investment, and it does put additional demands on governance. We need to reduce the likelihood of cost and time overruns, and we got to ensure a fair distribution of risks and rewards. But this is a particularly important issue because taxpayers all too often have had to shoulder the burden of badly designed public-private partnerships. What do you see as the key areas where infrastructure governance needs to improve, and so that private capital comes in and shoulders its fair share of the risk? Can you enlighten us on that?
I mean, ultimately, the success of the model will be determined by our ability to deliver on exactly that equation. There's a real risk in our endeavor to attract private capital into the asset class to deliver more infrastructure to Canadians, that we end up having the public entities, whether that's local, provincial, territorial, municipal, indigenous governments, or the federal funds, end up shouldering all of the risks, and the returns end up going to the private investors. And so the very first element that our team screen for when we look at a project is the ability for the project to be structured in such a way that the risks can be appropriately allocated to the parties best able to manage them. And that means ensuring that first we understand the risks really well. We understand who's best able to manage them, ensure that they have the tools to manage them through the life cycle of the project. And it's very important to take that life cycle perspective. And that we can then structure the legal documentation in a way such that if the time comes where certain risks have to be borne, they are borne by the right parties, rather than structured in such a way, which is not atypical, where the private investors, even if they lose all of their contributed capital, their equity capital in a project, there's still a big burden that's left for the government. So very, very important for us to ensure that there is enough private capital to shoulder enough of the risk so that they, frankly, earn their returns appropriately. So we have no problems with the private investors earning their return, whether those private investors are Canadian or international investors. In fact, we welcome all the capital. But we want that to happen in a way that is fair, and that is fair to ultimately the Canadian public. It's also why, as we tackle that challenge, it's very important for us to have the right team in place, both on the investment side, on the advisory side, but as well at our board of directors. And so we have an independent board of directors that's comprised of 11 people whose experience is in investment management, risk assessment, etc., so that they can provide the right wisdom and support to the management team in order to structure our investments appropriately.
Thank you. Mr. Mansvisi, in your experience, what are the common weaknesses in infrastructure governance, and how can capacity development support help improve the quality of infrastructure investment?
Well, I think that in our experience we can identify 4 major weaknesses. One, if what I indicated as a sort of starting point was not well examined, assessed, etc., leads to debt distress. And I mean, the situation is that even if all this is not necessarily linked only to investment for for infrastructure, but it is related to the management of public finance. It is, 40%, and this the IMF is saying that 40% of the low-income countries are at risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. So therefore, this is an issue that we have been discussing also in the G20 in the framework of the concept of quality infrastructure, and this is a weakness which is, if it is badly designed in the sense of the planning and the, let's say, the integrated financial framework, this is something that we will find. And therefore, this is a major issue that is not only governance, let's say, is much wider. The second point is corruption. The corruption is by more than 50% or close to 60% due to public procurement in infrastructure. So this is something which is a fact. And then corruption is not just an isolated act, as everybody says. It's a permanent failure in a system, or even worse in certain cases. So I think that a solid plan of, let's say, ring fencing, for example, the e-procurement has reduced a lot, but also of transparency of the administration. Reason why I underline the importance of the capacity building of administrations at all levels, including local, those which are closer. It are, let's say, elements that must be put in place in order to counter, and efficiency of the law, of course. But the second point is corruption. I mean, the third point is that the supervision. If the cycle of an infrastructure is not, let's say, supervised in an effective way, which does not mean that the state is every 5 minutes hanging over the shoulder of the people which are doing the work, but if there is not a constant monitoring, which is similar to the lifelong cycle in the sense of the expenditure and maintenance, so the management of the implementation of infrastructure project, this is that shortcoming which inevitably will transform them into higher costs or in lower impact or lower quality. This is something that we have experienced systematically. And the last point, the fourth one, which is very often not very much underlined or set a bit aside, is consensus. If in having designed and then implementing an infrastructure which, according to what we said at the beginning, at the end should deliver better for people, better quality of life, better services, the element of the consensus, meaning the participation, the ownership, all what is linking the final result and what is done by private or public, doesn't matter. The fact that this is perceived during the cycle of its implementation as really owned by the people, this is a weakness that we have seen. So therefore, this element of consensus often is not underlined, but I would like to put that here because we have seen that this is likely to affect or not affect the implementation and therefore the quality of the governance of the infrastructure.
Very good. Before I turn to Mr. Asakawa, can we just want to this point about you were saying on consensus. We've talked a lot about the infrastructure, the governance framework, but could any one of our panelists talk a little bit about whether there's a role for civil society in this kind of governance framework, in ensuring some level of accountability, and also the point I think you were getting at, Mr. Vansvini. I mean, large projects you have to acquire land. You have to sometimes relocate people. There are, environmental impacts that one of the panelists mentions. So this impacts the local people, very sometimes negatively, but for the social good. So it seems this issue of consensus is really important. How do we build in civil society in our governance frameworks? Could anyone volunteer a thought on that? Okay, Mr. Please.
Yeah, I think one way, at least from planning perspective, because this is our main job, is the involvement of civil society in the participatory planning. So we have the participatory planning starting from the bottom, from the village level up to the national level. And of course, in every level, they have to discuss what kind of projects that will be prioritized. I mean, infrastructure project that will be their priority at their level. So when it comes to the higher level, of course, they have to have argument why this project is important or necessary for them. And if they say that we need this project, for example, let's say provincial government saying to central government, we really need this project, then usually central government will ask the provincial government, please help the central government dealing with the people who live in the area of the projects, either in terms of land acquisition, environmental impact. So in this case, of course, provincial governments needs to involve the civil society, and they have to come up with the civil society that this is their decision. They need the project not for the government's sake only, but more importantly, for the needs of the people. And civil society should represent the voice of the local people. This is from the planning aspect.
Anyone else volunteer? There's another part, as part of this governance process, I wanted to ask, actually came up on maintenance, the importance of providing for the maintenance of infrastructure projects. I think certainly, that's one of the things that governments often neglect to plan for. And I think Mr. Lavalier made the point that, or was it the minister who just said, that there's incentives to provide for that in a private setting, but in a short-term government sort of political process that the budget might go through, you may not provide adequately for maintenance costs of infrastructure projects. I wonder whether our panelists could also share some thoughts on, are there countries that have done this well in practice? I mean, that, did they have a process by which to ensure that future budgets would leave aside adequate provision for maintenance of infrastructure projects that have been undertaken? Are there institutional frameworks that we could draw on that? Any thoughts?
Well, if I may, let's say in the infrastructure planning and the infrastructure execution, I think that in Africa, one good example and a good practice is what Rwanda has done, where not only the planning but also the means, which are sometimes inspiring also to reduce the level of ambitions, because when they spoke about consensus is to avoid that expectations are created and then not only they are not reached, but they're reached not with the accountability vis-à-vis the people. And very often this is also true for, or is linked to what the infrastructure is creating while implemented, which means having people which are trained, which people are then equipped to follow this infrastructure, which people which are able to utilize this infrastructure in a way or another. It is a mix of regulatory and financing. Regulatory, obvious, because if you take physical infrastructure like road or let's say water or energy, you need the sustainability is not only maintenance, but sustainability is in financial terms, for example. The tariff policy, reason why I put that into a public policy, which is necessary, because otherwise, it could have a good investment, but that doesn't matter, and which creates better knowledge. And second is the money which is not set aside, but the money which is calculated since the outset and then generated by the different financial technique which has been decided for the... Yeah. So, all in all, there are several examples in the world, but to say, talking about countries which are, in development, but which have also reached a certain level of coherence, I would say in Africa, Rwanda for sure is one of them. To a certain extent, also Ghana is in a similar situation. But very often, the potentiality of all this linking the good planning, the governance, and the quality of impact is increasingly to be put in a wider context, in a regional context. This is true in Africa, but is also true in other parts of the world. So let's not look at that only from a national or micro. Let's look at that in respect of the purpose, which very often is meaningful if there is a wider context. So this is a bit the way. And clearly, countries which are, let's say, earning a lot from commodities could offer good and bad example alike. Yeah. Then we can open another discussion on this, but I mean, it's a question of capacity here of the state.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mr. Asakawa for perhaps some concluding thoughts, so we have some time for some questions from the audience. Improving infrastructure governance has been an important part of the G20 work on promoting quality infrastructure investment, drawing on your long experience, also from the Ministry of Finance, both the G20 and also the Ministry of Finance experience. What do you see as critical for infrastructure governance? And if you were to advise another minister how to create a strong infrastructure governance system, what would you tell him or her?
Yeah, thank you, Shami. Well, actually, in terms of governance, aspect of high quality infrastructure, I really would like to emphasize three issues here. One is social consideration, and second is transparency, and third is debt sustainability. First, social considerations, which includes, for example, openness. Open and free access to any infrastructure service should be really secured in a very non-discriminatory way. And I think this is a very crucial to maximize economic impact of the infrastructure, and also this is a very crucial element to realize connectivity, which Minister Bamban just mentioned. And also under this heading, of course, gender consideration should be respected for labor market participation, capacity building, and also safety. Second one is transparency, especially transparency of procurement process. And this is very crucial. Openness and transparency of procurement should be secured to ensure that the infrastructure projects are value for money. And in this connection, of course, anti-corruption efforts should continue to safeguard the integrity and transparency of infrastructure investment, as many of the panelists already mentioned. And third one is debt sustainability. Sometimes we forget this, debt sustainability. And debt sustainability means two things. One is debt sustainability of that project by project level debt sustainability. But also we need to look at debt sustainability at a macro level, debt sustainability of that country. Project by project, this sustainability need to be taken into account. That's a matter of course need to say. But at the same time, once again, as Mr. Bamba mentioned, there's some type of infrastructure project that are not bankable enough to attract private financing because of the externalities. So therefore, infrastructure investment can have significant impact on public finance as well. Excessive public debt could well be a drag on the macro economy, which is inconsistent with the quality infrastructure concept of maximizing positive impacts of infrastructure investments. So a robust structure to prioritize projects subject to available financing should be a part of infrastructure governance. It will contribute to attaining macro-level debt sustainability. So, and this is why we asked the IMF to participate in our high-quality infrastructure agenda to help us. The fund has a technical expertise, very strong technical expertise on macro-fiscal issues, as well as rich experience in assessment and technical assistance in this area. So we therefore thought the fund would provide unique perspectives to the issue of infrastructure governance on this respect. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Asakawa. So I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. Are there microphones that we can use? Yes, a roving one. Lots of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually collect the questions in one round and then turn to the panelists to address them. So we should probably jot them down in case we forget. So if the gentleman over there and then the lady next to him. And please identify yourself and your organization.
Thank you very much, Madam. I'm Pradeep Kapoor. I'm professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. I've earlier worked for a long time in the Indian government as a foreign service officer, as an ambassador, as a secretary, and I am now working in Washington, D.C. Very interesting comments, very interesting discussion. Congratulations to the panelists. 2 questions very quickly. First question to Madam Moderator, Madam Kuri. You are in the Institute for Capacity Development at the IMF. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about transparency and corruption and capacity building. So in that regard, I want to, just curiosity, what sort of efforts are being made in the national digital financial infrastructure in terms of capacity building? Is there some diagnostics? Is there some mapping? Is there some referencing? And, what sort of reports or studies are there? And if there are some institutes which I am in touch with, can bring in some capacities to enhance these aspects of study. Who are the, whether it's your institute which will be coordinating or which is the right agency for that aspect. The second question is to the Vice Finance Minister of Japan. There is this $30 billion fund for Africa by Japan through special purpose vehicles out of Mauritius. Just wanted to know as to how and what are the aims and objectives and how it is going, and whether, we hear a lot of discussion about infrastructure, about investing in people. How much of it is being done for the villagers and villages? And there is some proposal, for example, for setting up some smart village development fund, whether that fund would have any interest for working in the African continent or in Asia or in other continents, for empowering the villagers, through various aspects of development, like the SDGs. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of a company called Segero's International Group. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., but I'm from Kenya. Looking at your thank you so much for your discussion. First, I want to thank the Prime Minister of Japan for his initiative of capacity building for young people from Africa to Japan who go there to train. That is one thing of investing in people and infrastructure. Just to follow up of what he has said, I focus on agriculture. My projects are in agriculture, supporting the agriculture in the rural areas. We're talking about some infrastructure. Are you looking at from the rural areas to the urban areas, or what quality of infrastructure are you looking at? Because the rural areas is where people stay, is where agriculture stay before we go to town. So what high quality infrastructure are you looking at that can benefit the common man, common people, food from the farm to the town to people like you to eat, because food is not grown in town, food is grown in the rural area. So what high quality infrastructure from rural area to urban, or from urban, and that's the end of the story. Thank you.
Okay, and there's a question back there. There's a gentleman back there, over there, and...
Yeah, thanks to the panel. My name is John Sword. I'm with the Bretton Woods Project based in London. And this is a question, I think, mainly for the Vice Minister of Finance from Japan. I'd be interested to know, we've heard a lot about different types of risks, but will the QII be looking more holistically at climate risks? A lot of investors now are aligning their portfolios with the sort of 1.5C pathway in line with a science-based target. So is this a consideration? The World Bank in February put out a new report called Beyond the Gap, pointing out that as part of countries' infrastructure planning processes, the sort of long-term cost of infrastructure is really based to a large degree on their accounting for climate risks at the start of that process, given the life cycle considerations. So I'd welcome any of the panelists' thoughts on this, but especially the Japanese Vice Minister. Thank you.
There's one over there and another question over there.
Good afternoon, Peter from Cornell Institute Public Policy. I have a question for the President of the Canada Investment Bank. So you mentioned about having private sector share their fair share of risk while getting their value. So what are your thoughts on how the government or local officials still track that private capital while they're looking for lower risk of investments, still looking for the return? Second, you mentioned having the right sector share the risk where they're better capable of a lot of the projects where they involve a lot of debt. They have government to be a kind of backups to ensure a lower cost of borrowing that end up having the government still bear the actual overrun cost just for the benefit of the project overrun. So what's your thoughts on that?
One there and then here.
Thanks. Andrew Simmons with Resilience.io. It's a UK initiative. To Mr. Manservisi, so the session description speaks of infrastructure and achieving higher economic returns from public investment, and I wanted to ask about some of the social returns, particularly regarding EU spatial policy, and so that if we think that, so I guess if we think, for example, of high-speed rail, and so has high-speed rail improved territorial cohesion? And I'm just wondering from the program, or sorry, excuse me, project selection and planning side of a project, and I suppose also the evaluation at the end. So, historically, for the last decades, that European spatial policy has prioritized a regional approach that politically legitimizes, so you talked about the consensus building before, in the case of high-speed rail, as a means to increase connectivity between two different regions in achieving economic and social cohesion, and so of areas of deprivation, for example. And we can think of Paul Krugman's Nobel Prize with the new economic geography, with clustering effects and agglomeration and innovation and everything else. So the question is if there's a shift in terms of how a balance could be achieved with projects, infrastructure projects, capital infrastructure projects that deserve subsidy, greater subsidy to achieve the social outcomes. And just to be slightly cheeky, very quickly, a second question to Minister Branjangaro of Indonesia. This is on climate risk, but just thinking of a different World Bank report, WRI, that just came out on nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. It's called Putting Nature to Work. Are there any sorts of projects that so if we think of green or natural infrastructure for green stormwater infrastructure, of combining gray infrastructure for capital infrastructure projects with green infrastructure or natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and then the financing facilities, I guess, that can enable that when it's, as we all know, or those working in the space know, that green infrastructure is much more difficult to finance, of course, because it's hard to cost engineer at a level of precision the ability of capturing water at a great level of precision, but then you achieve all sorts of co-benefits, as we know, whether it's property value from being near a water-facing area or air quality.
If I can ask you
thanks.
to please keep it short, yes, because there are many questions. A lady here, and then two gentlemen, and then some.
Thank you very much. My name is Tenza U from Public Legal Aid Network, Myanmar, also known as Burma. My question is to provide some thoughts from the panelists. When we are talking about infrastructural governance, how much are we taking into account and consideration the energy requirement, the current, for example, like in planning, execution, and kind of like a delivery of these projects, because we could end up having like huge infrastructure projects without sufficient energy, or we actually have sort of like national electrification plans, and then which we fail to incorporate those future infrastructure projects. So how much energy are we looking at, and how much should we put it into our consideration in governance for infrastructure? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to just take 2 more questions, and then we'll turn to the panel.
Ricardo Leopoldo, Agência Estado. What would be your main suggestion for emerging markets to handle a situation as far as the exchange rate mismatch? Because private investors, they have a complaint that is interesting the governments that provide some kind of mechanism to protect for exchange rate mismatch. So what would be the best one to not to bring some problems for the treasury for those countries?
And the final question over there.
Question as well.
Okay, well, we'll take both. And
To
then
both, yeah. This is implicit in what already was asked, but I'll ask it again. In terms of people having a say in these projects, what kinds of mechanisms are you trying to use to explain to rural people what the projects are, what their implications are? Have you set up commissions and intermediaries? A lot of these things are not very transparent to people, and to really have their input, they need to understand what's going on. This has been a question that's been played around with for decades, but perhaps you have some insights.
And the final one there.
I just want to second that question.
Okay, well, that was easy. Very good. So if I can maybe, Mr. Asakawa, I'll give you the floor first. Quite a few
I
for
try my
you.
best. Also, I may not be able to, fully cover your questions. Okay, about our initiative of 30 billion fund to Africa, I think this was committed in the context of our TICAT, initiative a couple of years ago, and the whole idea is how to catalyze private financing. Of course, 30 billion comes from taxpayers' money, but as I mentioned before, public finance alone, of course, is not totally insufficient to satisfy the huge demand in infrastructure area in African continent. So I hope that this 30 billion fund would be a good catalysis to attract sufficient amount of private financing. That's a basic idea of this fund. Does it really go to village by village, rural area or not? Yes, obviously, African continent is such a huge continent, so, village are very remote, and there maybe sometimes no road, no railway, and nothing. But, technology is coming here. If we properly use the technology in an efficient way, I think this, remoteness of the situation of village and local cities, rural area, can be overcome. So I once again hope that this fund, part of this fund, is utilized to introduce the proper technology to overcome this problem in the African continent. And also, I'd like to mention that overcapacity issue. Sometimes, ODA is provided to African countries regardless of its own development plan and so on. And I do hope that our initiative, high quality infrastructure initiative in the context of G20 would not result in any case where any G20 countries try to force any project which is not in line with your own development plan. That's one thing. Okay, climate risks. It's very difficult to integrate the climate risk into this kind of principles of high quality infrastructure. One thing I just mentioned is disaster risk, which has something to do with, of course, global warming. So indirectly, it's involved here. But another, maybe a way to accommodate this is to issue a green bond for quality infrastructure project. And we are now trying to, encourage, a Japanese company, many companies to, issue more and more green bond for the project and so on. So that could help. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you. Minister Brojonegoro?
Okay. I will start answering about the financing facility for green infrastructure. I think in terms of the supply of financing for green infrastructure, actually it is abundant because it becomes the trend that more and more investors would like to invest in the so-called green activities, including green infrastructure. But in fact, sometimes the problem not coming from the supply side, the financing, but from the demand side. Our ability to prepare the green projects that will attract the financing itself. Sometimes there are reluctancy for us to go into green infrastructure. So as a result, we have facilities of financing, but unfortunately it's not 100% utilized, simply because we don't have the pipeline of this green infrastructure. And one of the very typical green infrastructure is the renewable energy. But unfortunately, in Indonesia, renewable energy still has to compete with the coal, which is still abundant, in terms of the production. So as a result, when it comes to the price, the national electricity company will prefer to buy the cheaper electricity generated by the coal rather than renewable energy. So as a result, this green infrastructure, which is renewable energy project, becomes less viable and less attractive for private investor and also for getting the facility. Related to the question from the lady from Myanmar about the energy requirement, I would say that the issue now is not about whether we have enough energy or not, but related to the previous question, I think it's an issue whether we are going to do more with renewable or not. Because sometimes if we don't have enough energy, we can go to simple thing like diesel fuel. If you don't have any available energy, go to the diesel fuel because it's the most practical, although it's most expensive and of course not environmental friendly. And this is the challenge, I believe, for the renewable energy. How can renewable energy become as effective and practical as the diesel fuel? And of course, there has to be some kind of discovery in this renewable energy to be competitive with the diesel fuel. I would like to touch a little bit on the risk of exchange rate to attract private investor money. At least for Indonesia case, for power plant, airport, and seaport, there is no issue because all the tariff will be in US dollar. So there is no issue that any investor will have some currency risk. But of course, there will be currency risk if the tariff is in our currency, like toll road. So in this case, of course, we have hedging facility, but sometimes I understand the foreign investors are a bit reluctant to invest in a country that their currency is still kind of fluctuating. So I believe we need to improve this hedging facility, especially for investment in infrastructure. Last but not least, about the transparency at rural area, I can share one simple example from Indonesia. Now we have direct transfer from central government directly to the village, to the rural area. And there is so-called the rural government. And this rural government has to tell all the villagers, this is the amount they receive from central government this year. And then they have to lay out, let's say, through internet or through the board of the announcement that this year, with this amount, they will spend for roads, for irrigation, for health, for education. So I think this is one way to push for transparency at the very bottom level, at the rural level. Thank you.
Mr. Hans.
I would like to talk about maintenance, where I would stress the quality of the projects. If there is a high quality maintained, the cost of maintenance would be lower, and that's why supervision and control maintaining an oversight during the implementation of the project, it's always important to maintain a close look upon the implementation of the project. So that's why that would keep down the maintenance cost. The larger the cost for the project, that would also demand a high cost for maintenance. And I also want to talk about the energy sector. In our country, in Kosovo, we need efficient production of energy, and we need to invest in that. By investing in efficiency production through efficiency, we will lower the cost. But we have limited resources of renewable energy. We have limited water resources. We mainly rely on coal. We have investors that are interested in investing in coal. But because of the new policies that highlight the issue of pollution, the World Bank, the EBRD, have always been stressing and pushing us towards renewable energy. And we're mainly focused on private capital. And that's where we see our future when it comes to energy production. When it comes to renewable, we have wind and solar, and we are spending seriously in those renewable resources, and we hope in the future to have more increased proportion of renewable energy.
Thank you. Mr. Lavalette?
So I'll start with the question from the gentleman from Cornell on allocation of risks and the ability of, if I understand, the local authorities' ability to manage through the life cycle of a project. I think the starting point in any situation for us is to get the maximum amount of infrastructure built and servicing Canadians for the smallest possible amount of public money. And so if you start from that concept, you want as much private capital as possible to come, which means you want to transfer as much risk to that private capital as possible. Doing that blindly can lead you down a path where transferring that risk becomes very expensive. And that's where, when we think about the appropriate allocation of risk, it's both to those best able to manage them, best able to price them, and at a reasonable cost, ultimately, to the end users of the asset, who are going to be Canadian citizens. And so there is a balance to be struck, and that is part of the role that we are meant to play between the procurement entity or the public sponsor of a project and the private investors. Private investors will want to deploy enormous amounts of capital if you provide them enormous returns. It's just at some point there's an affordability question that you have to consider for the end users and for the taxpayers, and that's the equation that we try to assemble in a bit of an honest broker role, frankly, where at some level we want to, and this is happening real time, where transferring the risk to the private investor becomes too expensive for the public sponsor. We actually, with our capital and the fiscal room that we have within the federal budget, have the ability to inject some of our capital at a lower cost than market to bring down the cost to the public sponsors, so that you still have the risk best managed by the best person or best entity to manage them, the private sector, but at a cost and in a cost envelope that is reasonable for the taxpayer. In terms of the local authorities, and for us, we have we have a city of 5 million and a province of 100,000 people. So we have very different levels of capabilities and capacity across country, across the different levels of government, and in some cases just straight capacity. It's not capability. It's just they can only do so much with the means that they have, and that's why, while of course we have a big investment mandate to deploy $35 billion, we also have this advisory capability that we've put in place in order to work alongside the different levels of government, the different, and it's not just local, in some cases it's going to be provincial, territorial, but really at every scale in order to support them through the life cycle of the investment of the asset. So it's the job is not done for having perfectly structured an investment up front, injected our capital in the right place in the capital structure to ensure that there's appropriate risk allocation, and we have the flexibility to invest anywhere in the capital structure, from equity to senior loan and all hybrids in between. But it's important to remember that the job is not done once you get to financial close. It really is through the life of the investment, and we as an institution have to have the capability to provide that advice to the various levels of government throughout the life cycle. While I'm on life cycle, I'd add one more note on the question around climate risks and injecting that. I think there is also, from an investment perspective, you cannot invest in long life assets, which all infrastructure is, without considering climate risk. It just becomes part of, if it's a new project, you include it in the life cycle cost. If it's an existing asset and you'll have a concession for 30 years, you must include it in, you must price it in. And I think it's important, therefore, to bring that perspective. I think one of the best ways to include climate risk in how we plan and finance and deliver infrastructure is to include it, is to start from this life cycle cost concept rather than the construction costs, maybe some operations, maybe some maintenance, and kind of unbundle all that. I think if we bundle it all together, it forces the right perspective and the right discipline.
Thank you. Mr. Manservisi.
Well, thank you. I think maybe three points on which I could maybe add something. One, on the social return. Yes, this is, it depends how this is defined, but in any case, social return, it could be job creation, it could be impact on the environment of life, it could be both. So in any case, this is for whatever infrastructure, physical infrastructure in particular, but also digital and others. We are part of the dialogue that we have at the beginning. And by the way, what I would like also to underline is our method. We don't arrive with a ready-made infrastructure plan. We arrive with a partnership, long-lasting, by the way, and with experience to share. And then we want to accommodate ourselves in the framework of what is policy planning. My two first points that I said at the beginning, I put that at the beginning because it is our working method. And then going down from that, preparing, analyzing the impact, the social the priority, where they create more job in a sustainable way, not just for the short period. And the, let's say, the economic output, which is true in certain region, we, maybe because it's a bit in our DNA, we are very much attracted by infrastructure which are interconnecting people and market. It is a bit our experience. Not necessarily high-speed train, by the way. I think we did very few. Because presumably we are not competitive with other big partners. Also because in doing all this chain, inevitably we take more time than to put a bit of concrete somewhere. So this is something that we have also to consider. But clearly, social impact and the territorial cohesion, yes. And then sometimes we make mistake. It's not that the point. But yeah, these are factors which are put into our dialogue, and then our test of sustainability, because at the end, the territorial cohesion is not us that we are managing, but the countries which are managing. So in this, if I may say, the second point concerning the people, how people can have a say. In our partnership, we suggest every time that it's not to be explained how good it is, but to design and possibly to conceive with them what is eventually arriving on a territory, on a sector, on a market, etc. So this is the way, and there are ways, there are ways which are not too complicated. If institutionally, politically, etc., it is affordable. But if we are not convinced that an infrastructure, whatever kind, is built with a full awareness and accountability of the government or the private investor vis-à-vis communities, we are usually refrain because we know that this is not sustainable. And then, so then third point is the risk of local currency. I'd like to come on this. Why? because in our new approach, which is de-risking private investment, and not only supporting public through blending, etc., we are start working with several of our development agencies in our member state to see how we can lend in local currency. And precisely using the development aid that we can provision to guarantee and de-risk precisely the fact that normal investors that could be attracted to do a certain investment in a certain country, but they are scared precisely by the fluctuation or by the rate of return, they don't do it. Now, we are starting schemes of guarantee which are precisely limiting this kind of risk, and we believe that the market of lending in local currency is rather on rise, and I think we should all think about that, because this will have a certain number of byproducts, let's say, which could be extremely interesting in the medium and in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just, the question that was addressed to me. So the IMF does, in fact, the Fiscal Affairs Department does provide capacity development support, not my department, but another, the one that is sponsoring this one, on bringing tax administrations and PFM systems into the digital age, e-procurement, digitizing revenue administrations, customs clearing, and integrating those into the public administration system. So there is some work in that area that the Fiscal Affairs Department does. So I want to thank our panelists. Please, thank you very much. And thank you for this very interesting discussion and being such a great audience. And just to remind, there is a cocktail reception outside, so please do join us. Thank you.